Good evening, everyone. There are moments in life when the world sees the glamour, the power, the success, but very few ever see the wounds that lie beneath. My mother, Ivana Trump, was more than a first wife, more than a headline. She was a woman of strength, of ambition, and of unshakable dignity. But there was one betrayal that left a scar so deep, she never allowed herself to forgive it. This is not just a story about infidelity. It is not just about a marriage that ended, it's about what happens when trust is broken in the most brutal, public, and humiliating way. It's about resilience, pride, and the cost of betrayal that cannot be undone. Tonight, I want you to walk with me through her journey, because hidden inside her silence, inside her refusal to forgive, is a lesson for every single one of us about strength, about boundaries, and about why sometimes protecting your dignity matters more than granting forgiveness. So listen closely, because this isn't just my mother's story. In many ways, it's a mirror for anyone who has ever been broken, betrayed, or tested by life itself. When I think about my mother's journey, I cannot begin without addressing one moment that shook her foundation, the moment that defined so much of the path she would take afterward. It was the betrayal that shattered not just a marriage, but the very trust and loyalty she had built her life around. Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. It rarely does. The deepest cuts are made by the people closest to us, the ones we never imagined would hurt us, the ones who swore to stand by us, honor us, and protect us. That is why, when betrayal arrives, it feels like an earthquake ripping through the ground beneath your feet. For my mother, that betrayal came in the form of another woman. It wasn't hidden in the shadows for long. It spilled into the light for the whole world to see. Imagine living your life with grace, with ambition, with dignity, and suddenly being thrust into a storm you didn't choose. A storm that questioned your worth, your marriage, your family. Imagine waking up to discover that the foundation you built your home on was no longer solid because someone else had entered and cracked it apart. It wasn't just the loss of trust between two people. It was the collapse of the life she thought she had. Love, respect, and loyalty, those are not things you can simply glue back together after they've been broken. They are fragile, they are precious, and once they've been shattered in such a public, humiliating way, the damage feels irreparable. My mother carried herself with strength, but inside, she felt the piercing sting of betrayal that no apology could ever heal. People often ask why she never forgave, but to understand that, you must understand what forgiveness would have meant to her. Forgiveness in this case wasn't simply letting go. It would have meant minimizing the pain, pretending that the wound wasn't as deep as it was. It would have meant giving grace to someone who had taken from her the one thing that can never be replaced, her trust. And my mother, as strong as she was, refused to offer her heart as a doormat. She refused to allow betrayal to be excused. The betrayal wasn't just about a husband and a wife. It was about a family. It was about children caught in the middle of a story they never asked to be part of. Every betrayal ripples outward, touching more lives than the two people directly involved. My mother knew that her children would feel the sting of whispers, of headlines, of judgment from people who never knew the full story. She knew that her pain would be magnified because it wasn't private. It was displayed for the world to consume like entertainment. And yet through that devastation, she didn't collapse. She didn't allow betrayal to define her as a victim. She rose, but she rose differently. Stronger, more guarded, less willing to offer forgiveness where forgiveness was not earned. Because betrayal of that magnitude does not just bruise, it carves permanent scars, and sometimes those scars become reminders of the battles you survived. There is something people rarely talk about when it comes to betrayal, the loss of identity. When the person you love chooses someone else, it makes you question everything. Am I not enough? Was I blind to the truth? Did I miss the signs? These questions plague the mind, and they are far more torturous than the betrayal itself. My mother had to battle those demons alone. She had to wake up every morning and remind herself that her worth was not defined by someone else's disloyalty. That lesson, though painful, was one she carried with her for the rest of her life. But let me tell you, this betrayal, as brutal as it is, can also awaken strength you never knew you had. My mother chose to redirect her pain into her purpose. She poured herself into her children. She built her independence. She reminded the world that while a man could betray her, nothing could destroy her spirit. And that decision, that refusal to be diminished, was perhaps her greatest act of defiance. She proved that betrayal could break her heart, but it could never break her will. Still, the wound remained. The betrayal was not something she could erase, and forgiveness was not something she believed was deserved. To forgive is to release someone from accountability, and she could never release the one who had stolen not just her husband, but her sense of security. For her, forgiveness would have been a betrayal of herself, a silencing of her own pain, a denial of what she had endured, and that she could never allow. When betrayal comes into your life, you are given two choices. You can let it destroy you, or you can let it define your strength. My mother chose the latter. She wore her pain with dignity. She never pretended it hadn't happened, but she also never allowed it to dictate her future. She built a life beyond betrayal, but she never erased the memory of it. And in many ways, that refusal to forgive was her way of holding onto her self-respect. It was her way of saying, "What you did was unforgivable, and I will never let you think otherwise." There is a lesson in that for all of us. We live in a world that tells us to forgive quickly, to move on, to let go. But sometimes moving on means drawing a line that cannot be crossed again. Sometimes the greatest act of strength is not in forgiving, but in refusing to allow betrayal to be diminished. Because when we forgive too easily, we risk teaching others that our dignity is negotiable. My mother understood this better than anyone. She knew that some wounds are too deep, some betrayals too cruel, some humiliations too public. She knew that forgiveness would never set her free. It would only hand power back to the one who had wronged her. And that she could never do. Betrayal is one of life's most painful teachers. It strips away illusions, it forces you to see the truth you didn't want to face, and it reshapes who you are. My mother walked through that fire. She bore the weight of that betrayal with unshakable resolve. She carried it not as a weakness, but as a reminder that no one could ever take away her self-respect. And that is why she never forgave, because in her heart she knew that forgiveness is not always noble. Sometimes the noblest thing you can do is to honor your pain, protect your dignity, and never excuse the inexcusable. And that is the truth of why she never forgave. If betrayal was not already painful enough, what made my mother's experience unbearable was the way it unfolded, not quietly, not privately, not in a way that allowed her to protect her dignity behind closed doors. No, her heartbreak became a public story. It was not just her pain, it was the world's entertainment, and that, in many ways, was the most devastating part of it all. When the details of the affair became public, the world consumed them like fuel for gossip. Every headline, every photograph, every whisper was magnified and broadcast. Imagine walking into a room knowing that everyone already knows the most intimate wound in your life. Imagine not being able to shield your children from the newspapers at the breakfast table, not being able to hide from the whispers in the grocery store, not being able to escape the looks of pity or judgment. That was her reality. It wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. Humiliation that followed her into every corner of her life, humiliation that did not end when she closed her front door. It traveled with her, shadowing her every move. Betrayal in private is cruel enough, but betrayal in public strips you bare. It makes you a spectacle, an object of ridicule, a character in a story you never agreed to star in. And for a woman of my mother's strength and pride, that humiliation was unforgivable. We must remember that in those years, media was relentless. It was not compassionate. It thrived on drama, it thrived on scandal, and it thrived on tearing women down. My mother became a headline, a punchline, a curiosity. Her heartbreak became late night television jokes, magazine covers, conversations at dinner tables around the world. To see your private life consumed by strangers is an agony that cannot be explained unless you have lived it. And through all of that, she was expected to smile, to remain composed, to continue her role as a mother, as a businesswoman, as a public figure. That expectation was as heavy as the betrayal itself. What made forgiveness impossible was not only the act of betrayal, but the humiliation that never seemed to fade. When wounds are reopened daily by cameras, reporters, articles, and whispers, healing is not possible. Forgiveness becomes a fantasy when the pain is rehearsed and replayed every single day in public view. And my mother lived in that storm for years. I have often thought about how difficult it must have been to hold her head high, to walk into rooms knowing people were looking at her with judgment or curiosity, when inside she was still carrying the humiliation of betrayal, but she did it. She dressed beautifully, she carried herself with grace, and she gave the world her best face, even when the world had shown her its cruelest side. That strength came at a cost, though, because while the world saw her smile, she was carrying a pain that never left her. There is something uniquely cruel about having your heartbreak dissected by millions of strangers. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a side to take. Everyone wanted to know the details, but no one wanted to understand her pain. No one wanted to understand what it means to have your dignity ripped away in the most public manner possible. When humiliation becomes entertainment, the wounds are not just personal, they are amplified, intensified, made unbearable. Some people might say time heals everything, but time does not heal humiliation. Time only reminds you of what was lost, and of how the world enjoyed watching your suffering unfold. That is why forgiveness was never possible for her. Because how do you forgive when the world will not let you forget? How do you let go when every article, every joke, every whisper drags you back into the pain you're trying to escape? Forgiveness may come when wounds are allowed to close, but humiliation keeps them open forever. And this is why, despite the strength she carried, despite the life she rebuilt, there was always a part of her that could never forgive. To her, forgiveness would have been like saying the humiliation didn't matter, like saying the world's laughter at her expense was insignificant, like saying the betrayal could be brushed aside. But she knew better. She knew humiliation is the cruelest form of pain because it does not just wound. It erases dignity, it steals confidence, and it haunts you in ways private pain never can. She was a woman who valued dignity above all. She valued her role as a mother, her role as a leader, her role as a woman who had built a life of her own. But when the betrayal became public humiliation, it struck at the very thing she held most dear, her pride. And for that reason, she could not and would not forgive. There is a lesson in that for all of us. We are told often to forgive because it frees us. But sometimes the reality is different. Sometimes forgiveness is impossible because humiliation leaves a wound deeper than betrayal itself. Sometimes the act of not forgiving is not about bitterness. It is about protecting the last shred of dignity you still hold. And sometimes refusing to forgive is the only way to say, I still matter. What was done to me was not acceptable, and I will not allow it to be excused. The world may have laughed, but my mother did not crumble. She endured humiliation that would have destroyed many, but she endured it with strength. She turned her pain into resilience. She raised her children with pride. She built a life beyond betrayal, beyond humiliation. But she never forgave, because some humiliations leave a scar too deep to ever allow such release. And that is why forgiveness was never an option. When people look back on her life, they often see the glamour, the power, the confidence that radiated from every room she walked into. But what many forget is that strength is not born out of comfort. Strength is carved out of pain. It is shaped in those moments when you are forced to choose between crumbling and rising, between letting betrayal define you or redefining yourself in spite of it. My mother chose to rise, but she rose differently. She rose with a resolve that was harder, sharper, and unwilling to bend toward forgiveness where forgiveness was not deserved. After betrayal and humiliation, she could have given in to despair. Many people would have. It would have been easy to retreat into bitterness, to hide away from the world, to let that single chapter dictate the rest of her life. But she refused to allow that. She understood that strength wasn't about denying her pain, but about deciding what to do with it. She chose to transform her pain into power, and in doing so, she became an example of what resilience truly looks like. She poured her energy into her children, ensuring that their world remained as stable as possible, even when hers had been turned upside down. She became the steady hand, the protective force, the shield that absorbed the chaos so they wouldn't have to. She focused on building her career, her independence, her name. She refused to let the betrayal and humiliation be the final word of her story. That was her strength, not forgiveness, not forgetting, but the decision to keep moving forward with dignity, carrying the scar as a reminder rather than as a weakness. What is remarkable is how she wore her strength so elegantly. To the world, she appeared unshaken, radiant, untouchable. But beneath that elegance was a steely resolve forged in fire. She had learned that forgiveness is not always the high road, that sometimes the true high road is holding firm to your boundaries, refusing to pretend that betrayal can be erased. Her refusal to forgive was not bitterness, it was self-respect. It was her way of saying that her pain mattered, her dignity mattered, and she would not minimize either for the comfort of others. Strength, for her, did not mean pretending the betrayal had not happened. It meant living with the memory of it every day and still choosing to stand tall. It meant carrying scars that never fully healed, and yet building a life so full and so meaningful that those scars became symbols of survival rather than defeat. Many people believe forgiveness is the only way to heal, but she proved that healing can also come through resilience, through creating something powerful out of brokenness, through showing the world that you cannot be destroyed by what was done to you. She never allowed herself to be defined by victimhood. Yes, she was betrayed. Yes, she was humiliated. But she would not be reduced to just that. She became more determined, more driven, more focused. She refused to hand power back to the ones who had taken so much from her. That was her act of strength, to stand in her truth, to acknowledge the wound, but to refuse to let forgiveness cheapen her experience or diminish her dignity. We live in a world where women are constantly told to forgive, to move on, to be graceful in their suffering. But she challenged that idea. She showed that sometimes strength means saying no. Sometimes strength means holding the line, refusing to release those who have wronged you from the weight of what they've done. Sometimes the refusal to forgive is not weakness, but the most powerful declaration of self-worth you can make. The strength she embodied was not just for herself. It was for her children, too. She wanted them to see that betrayal does not have to destroy you, that humiliation does not have to silence you, that scars can become symbols of resilience. She wanted them to understand that life will test you in ways you cannot imagine. But your response to those tests defines you more than the pain itself. She showed them and the world that dignity is non-negotiable. Her resilience was not soft, it was not forgiving, it was not easy. It was fierce, it was unyielding, it was uncompromising. She carried herself with pride not because she was untouched by betrayal, but because she had survived it and refused to let it break her spirit. That is why she could never forgive, because for her, forgiveness would have felt like surrender, like diminishing her own strength, like letting betrayal win. She chose instead to stand firm in her pain and transform it into something greater. This is the essence of strength. It is not about pretending the wound doesn't exist. It is about living with it, carrying it, and still building a future you can be proud of. It is about refusing to let betrayal define your life, even if it marks you forever. She showed that strength does not always look like letting go. It can also look like holding on, remembering, and using that memory as fuel to build something stronger. In the end, she became a symbol of resilience not because she forgave, but because she refused to forgive. Because she turned her refusal into power, her pain into pride, her scars into symbols. And in that, she showed that strength can take many forms, but the truest form of strength is honoring yourself above all else. And that is why her strength was unforgettable. When people ask why forgiveness was never an option, they often ask it as though forgiveness is the natural conclusion to every story of pain. They believe that healing is only possible if you let go, that peace can only come through releasing those who have wronged you. But the truth is, not every wound can be healed by forgiveness. Some betrayals run too deep, and some scars never allow you to return to the person you were before. For my mother, forgiveness was never possible, not because she didn't know the meaning of grace, but because she understood the weight of what had been taken from her. To forgive in this situation would have been to erase the gravity of the betrayal. It would have been to say that the destruction of her marriage, the humiliation she endured, the years of whispers and headlines, were somehow not as significant as they truly were. Forgiveness, in her mind, would have meant minimizing the truth of her experience, reducing her pain to a momentary lapse, and pretending that it could all be wiped away with an apology. But she knew better. She knew that forgiveness in this case would not bring healing. It would bring dishonor to herself. Some people think forgiveness is about setting yourself free, but sometimes refusing to forgive is the only way to honor the reality of what you've lived through. It is a way of standing firmly in your truth and refusing to rewrite history for the comfort of others. For her, forgiveness would have felt like surrender. It would have been a quiet acceptance that what had been done to her was tolerable. And she refused to let that be her story. She believed that some betrayals are so profound that they deserve to remain unforgiven. Her refusal was not born of hatred. It was not bitterness eating away at her. It was clarity. Clarity that some acts can never be undone and therefore should never be absolved. She understood that her dignity was tied to her boundaries, and that forgiving what was unforgivable would mean betraying herself. She would not let anyone believe that betrayal of that magnitude could be excused. She chose, instead, to let her refusal to forgive stand as a statement, a declaration that her pain was valid, that her experience mattered, and that what was taken from her could never be returned. We live in a culture that often glorifies forgiveness, as though refusing it is a weakness. But sometimes forgiveness is not strength, it is erasure. Sometimes forgiveness does not heal, it silences, and sometimes the most powerful act is to say, "No, I will not let this be forgotten. I will not allow this to be excused." That was her truth. That was her power. She knew that forgiveness is not always the answer, and she had the courage to live that reality, even when the world expected otherwise. This is something most people do not understand. To never forgive is not to live in anger, it is to live in acknowledgement. It is to accept that some betrayals are permanent, that some wounds change you forever, that some pain becomes a part of your story in a way that forgiveness cannot erase. For her, forgiveness was not the path to peace. Peace came from building her own life, from raising her children with pride, from reclaiming her independence, from proving to herself and the world that she could rise. That was her healing. Forgiveness had no role in it, and in her refusal there is a lesson for all of us. We are not obligated to forgive everyone who wrongs us. We are not obligated to minimize our pain for the sake of appearing noble. We are not required to hand back dignity to those who stripped it away. Sometimes the greatest form of healing comes not from forgiving, but from standing firm in the truth of what happened and saying, "This will never be okay." Her decision not to forgive was not an anchor holding her down. It was a shield protecting her from rewriting her story in a way that made it easier for others to swallow. She understood that forgiveness would not give her peace. It would only give comfort to the one who had caused her pain. And she refused to allow that. She refused to let anyone else write the ending to her story. What makes this powerful is that she was never consumed by revenge. She did not waste her life chasing apologies or retribution. She simply lived with the reality of betrayal and built a future that proved she was unbroken. Her refusal to forgive was not about looking backward, it was about protecting her forward. It was about ensuring that the betrayal remained what it was, a wound that could never be healed by words alone. Sometimes the noblest act is not to forgive, but to refuse to excuse. Sometimes the highest form of strength is not to let go, but to hold firmly to your truth. That is what she did. She carried herself with dignity. She built her future with strength, but she never allowed forgiveness to rewrite her story. And in that refusal, she found her power. That is why forgiveness was never an option.